May 8th, 1945. If General George Smith Patton had been silenced that spring day in Europe, the next 50 years of world history would have been written in blood. Not the blood of one nation, not 10,000 men, but millions. The man they called Old Blood and Guts stood at the precipice of victory. The Nazi war machine lay crushed beneath the tracks of his tanks, yet he alone saw the gathering storm. While champagne corks popped across Allied headquarters, while generals congratulated themselves on defeating Hitler, George Smith Patton stared eastward and saw something that would haunt the world for half a century. He saw the true enemy, and when he tried to warn them, when he demanded action, they called him crazy. This is what happened next. They called him Old Blood and Guts, a name earned through years of leading from the front, charging into battle while other generals commanded from behind the lines. His pearl-handled pistols had become legendary. His profanity-laced speeches were whispered about in every United States Army barracks from Normandy to Berlin. But on that spring day, as Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally, George Smith Patton wasn't celebrating. He was calculating. The Third Army had torn through Europe like a wildfire, 600 miles in 6 months, from the beaches of France to the heart of Germany. Old Blood and Guts had liberated more territory, captured more enemy soldiers, and killed more Nazi troops than any other Allied commander. His tanks had crossed the Rhine. His men had liberated concentration camps. The swastika had been ripped down from 1,000 German towns by soldiers who worshipped their commander. But Patton saw something his fellow generals refused to acknowledge. As United States forces met Soviet troops along the Elbe River, as American and Russian soldiers embraced and shared vodka and cigarettes, George Smith Patton watched with growing horror. He'd spent weeks observing the Red Army. He'd seen their equipment, their tactics, their brutality. He'd heard the reports from liberated territories in the East, reports of Soviet atrocities that made his blood run cold. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had been obliterated. But Old Blood and Guts knew the real fight was just beginning. And he was about to make the most controversial demand of his legendary career, a demand so explosive it would nearly destroy him, a warning so prophetic it would echo through the decades of the Cold War that followed. May 10th, 1945. 2 days after victory, George Smith Patton requested an urgent meeting with Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. What he was about to propose would shock the world, but Old Blood and Guts was about to change history. The meeting took place at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. General George Smith Patton strode into the room with the confidence that had defined his entire military career. Eisenhower sat behind his desk, exhausted from the weeks of final offensives and surrender negotiations. Other generals lounged in their chairs, already planning their return to the United States. The war was won. Time to go home. Patton didn't sit down. "We're going to have to fight them," George Smith Patton said, without preamble, his voice cutting through the celebratory atmosphere like a blade. "The Russians. We need to attack now, while we have the advantage." The room fell silent. Eisenhower looked up slowly. "George, we just finished fighting the biggest war in human history. The president wants our boys home." "The president doesn't understand what's happening here," Old Blood and Guts shot back. He pulled out a map, spreading it across the desk with both hands. "Look at this. Look at what the Soviets have done in Poland, in Romania, in Hungary. They're not liberating these countries, Ike. They're occupying them. They're installing communist puppet governments. They're murdering anyone who opposes them." Another general spoke up, his voice dripping with exhaustion and dismissal. "Patton, we're allies with the Soviet Union. They helped us defeat Hitler." George Smith Patton's eyes flashed with anger. "We helped Stalin defeat Hitler. Now Stalin is more dangerous than Hitler ever was. The difference is, Hitler never pretended to be our friend." He jabbed his finger at the map, tracing the Soviet advance. "Right now, today, we have 85 divisions in Europe, battle-hardened, combat-ready. The Third Army alone could reach Moscow in 30 days. The Red Army is exhausted. Their supply lines are stretched to breaking. Their equipment is inferior to ours. They've lost 20 million people. They're vulnerable. This is our chance." Eisenhower rubbed his temples. "Our chance to do what, George? Start World War III?" Our chance to prevent World War III, Patton countered immediately. His voice rose with passion. Ike, I've talked to Russian officers. I've seen their tanks, their artillery, their ambitions. Stalin has no intention of allowing free elections in Eastern Europe. He's going to swallow every country between here and Moscow, and then he's going to keep pushing west. If we don't stop him now, we'll be fighting him in 10 years anyway. Except then he'll have nuclear weapons and we'll be fighting on ground he's already fortified. The room erupted in objections. That's insane. The American people would never support it. We can work with Stalin diplomatically. You're talking about attacking our ally. Old Blood and Guts slammed his fist on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. They are not our ally. They were never our ally. They were Hitler's ally until Hitler invaded them. Stalin signed a pact with the Nazis. He carved up Poland with Hitler. The only reason we're on the same side is because Hitler stabbed him in the back first. George Smith Patton's face was red now, his legendary temper fully ignited. I've seen what the Russians do. I've talked to Polish refugees. I've heard testimony from people who escaped Soviet occupation. They shoot officers, they rape women, they deport entire populations to Siberia. And we're just going to shake hands with them and pretend everything's fine? Eisenhower stood up. George, that's enough. But Patton wasn't finished. We have German prisoners of war sitting in camps right now. Wehrmacht soldiers who know the Soviets better than anyone. Some of them would fight for us against the Russians. We could rearm 2 German divisions, combine them with our forces. That's enough! Eisenhower's voice cracked like thunder. The room went dead silent. You're talking about rearming the Nazis? The people we just spent 4 years defeating? Do you have any idea how that would sound to the world? To the United States Congress? To the American people who just won this war? George Smith Patton met his commander's eyes without flinching. I'm talking about doing what's necessary. I'm talking about looking ahead instead of celebrating yesterday. Every day we wait, the Soviets dig in deeper. Every day we wait, more people in Eastern Europe disappear into Stalin's gulags. Every day we wait, we lose the strategic advantage. Another general spoke carefully. General Patton, even if we wanted to do this, which we don't, the American public is exhausted. They want demobilization, not another war. There's no political support for what you're suggesting. Old Blood and Guts turned to face him. Then it's our job to make them understand what's at stake. Franklin Roosevelt died believing Stalin would honor his promises at Yalta. He was wrong. Harry Truman is new to the job. Someone needs to tell him the truth. Eisenhower's voice was cold now. The decision has been made, George. We're not attacking the Soviet Union. We're going to work with them to build a peaceful post-war order. That's what our governments have decided. That's what the United Nations is for. The United Nations? Patton's laugh was bitter. The Soviets will use the United Nations like they used the non-aggression pact with Hitler, as a shield while they grab everything they can. Mark my words, Ike. We're going to regret this. We defeated the wrong enemy. The room froze. Those words, "we defeated the wrong enemy," would follow George Smith Patton for the rest of his life. Eisenhower's voice was measured, controlled, final. You're dismissed, General. I suggest you get some rest. The war's over. But Old Blood and Guts knew better. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. And he was about to discover exactly how dangerous it was to tell the truth. Could George Smith Patton convince anyone to listen? The next 6 months would tell. May 19th, 1945. General George Smith Patton sat in his headquarters in Bavaria, Germany, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports. While other commanders planned victory parades and discussed occupation policies, Old Blood and Guts was documenting everything he saw. Every Soviet movement, every report of Red Army atrocities, every indication that Stalin was building an empire, not liberating nations. He wrote letters to military officials in Washington. He filed reports with the War Department. He spoke to journalists, though carefully, knowing his words would be explosive. George Smith Patton was building a case, collecting evidence, preparing to sound an alarm that no one wanted to hear. His own officers watched him with concern. The Third Army loved their commander with fierce loyalty, but even they wondered if Old Blood and Guts was pushing too far. The war was won. Why couldn't their general celebrate like everyone else? But Patton couldn't celebrate because he couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed. In late April, before the German surrender, Third Army units had liberated areas of Czechoslovakia. George Smith Patton had personally toured these towns. He'd talked to civilians who had lived under Nazi occupation and were now terrified of Soviet occupation. Their stories were identical. The Red Army was worse. Women hid in cellars when Russian soldiers approached. Men disappeared in the night, arrested by the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, for imaginary crimes. Communist Party officials arrived within hours of liberation, already preparing lists of people to be purged. Property was confiscated, churches were closed. Anyone who spoke favorably about the Americans was marked for elimination. Old Blood and Guts filed report after report. The Soviet Union was not behaving like an ally building democracy. They were behaving like conquerors building an empire. And George Smith Patton had seen empires before. He'd fought them in North Africa. He'd crushed them in France. He recognized tyranny when he saw it. June 7, 1945. Patton met with Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson during a tour of the European theater. Patterson was there to assess occupation plans and demobilization schedules. George Smith Patton saw an opportunity. "Mr. Secretary, we need to talk about the Soviet problem," Patton began, spreading intelligence reports across the table. "Look at these movements. The Red Army isn't demobilizing. They're repositioning. They're strengthening their hold on Poland, on Eastern Germany, on the Balkans. While we're sending troops home, they're consolidating power." Patterson studied the documents with a troubled expression. "General Patton, I understand your concerns, but the President believes we can work with Marshal Stalin. We have agreements." "Agreements Stalin is already breaking," Old Blood and Guts interrupted. "The Yalta Agreement promised free elections in Poland. There will be no free elections. It promised the same for Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. It won't happen. Stalin is installing communist dictatorships in every territory his army occupies. This is conquest, not liberation." Patterson was silent for a long moment. "What are you proposing?" George Smith Patton leaned forward. "I'm proposing we don't disarm. I'm proposing we keep our forces at strength in Europe. I'm proposing we draw a line, right here." He traced a line on the map. "And make it clear to Stalin that he advances no further. If he refuses, we push him back, all the way back to Russia." "You're talking about war with the Soviet Union." "I'm talking about preventing the next war," Patton said intensely. "Or at least making sure we fight it now, when we have every advantage, instead of fighting it in 5 or 10 years when Stalin has rebuilt his forces, developed his own atomic weapons, and fortified every inch of Eastern Europe. Right now, the United States military is the strongest force in human history. We have battle-tested troops, superior equipment, air supremacy, and atomic weapons. The Soviets have none of that. This is our moment." Patterson shook his head slowly. "General, the American people want peace. Congress wants demobilization. The President wants cooperation with our allies. What you're suggesting is politically impossible." George Smith Patton's jaw tightened. "Then the politicians are going to condemn millions of people to slavery and set up our children for another world war. Because that's what's coming, Mr. Secretary, as surely as I'm sitting here. Stalin is not Churchill. He's not Roosevelt. He's not interested in democracy or human rights or any of the principles we supposedly fought this war to defend. He's interested in power, and we're handing him everything he wants." The meeting ended with polite thanks and no commitments. Patterson returned to Washington with Patton's reports, but Old Blood and Guts knew nothing would come of it. The political will didn't exist. The public appetite for another war was non-existent. And the military establishment wanted to believe that the alliance with the Soviet Union was real, that Stalin could be trusted, that the United Nations would somehow keep the peace. George Smith Patton returned to his duties as military governor of Bavaria, but he couldn't let it go. Throughout June and July of 1945, he continued to speak out, at social gatherings with other officers, in conversations with visiting dignitaries, in carefully worded comments to reporters. Always the same message: the Soviet Union is not our friend. Stalin is not trustworthy. We need to act now. His superiors grew increasingly alarmed. Eisenhower sent messages urging caution. The War Department issued directives about appropriate comments from senior officers. But Old Blood and Guts was constitutionally incapable of keeping quiet when he believed the truth needed to be told. July 17, 1945. The Potsdam Conference began outside Berlin. President Truman, Prime Minister Churchill, and Marshal Stalin met to decide the future of post-war Europe. George Smith Patton was not invited, but he submitted detailed memoranda outlining his concerns. He recommended against any agreements that would legitimize Soviet control of Eastern Europe. He urged the president to demand free elections monitored by Western observers. He warned that Stalin would interpret any weakness as an invitation to grab more territory. His recommendations were ignored. The Potsdam Agreement recognized Soviet occupation of Eastern Poland, Eastern Germany, and the Baltic states. It promised free elections that would never happen. It divided Germany into occupation zones that would harden into the Iron Curtain. Everything George Smith Patton had warned about was coming true, and the Allied leadership was enabling it. By August of 1945, Old Blood and Guts was no longer hiding his frustration. In a meeting with journalists on August 8, 1945, he made comments that would seal his fate. When asked about Soviet cooperation in occupied Germany, George Smith Patton said bluntly, "The Russians are as much our enemies as the Nazis were. They're totalitarian, they're brutal, and they're going to be a threat to Western civilization for as long as they exist." The quotes hit newspapers across the United States within days. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Congress erupted in controversy. Soviet officials demanded an apology. The War Department was flooded with complaints, and Eisenhower was ordered to deal with his troublesome subordinate once and for all. September 28, 1945. General George Smith Patton received a telegram from Supreme Headquarters. He was being relieved of command of the Third Army, the army he had built, the men he had led to victory, the force that had liberated Europe, stripped away because he told the truth. But the real punishment was still coming, and it would come in the form of silence, exile, and a mysterious accident that would end the life of Old Blood and Guts just as his greatest prophecy began to come true. October 2nd, 1945. George Smith Patton was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a paper organization with virtually no operational responsibilities. It was a humiliation designed to sideline him until he could be quietly retired. Old Blood and Guts knew exactly what was happening. He was being punished for speaking truth to power, but Patton refused to be silenced. If anything, his removal from combat command freed him to speak even more openly. Without the responsibilities of leading troops, he focused entirely on warning anyone who would listen about the Soviet threat. He wrote articles, he gave speeches to veteran groups, he corresponded with congressmen. He became obsessed with making people understand what he had seen. In November of 1945, George Smith Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice, "The whole Russian question seems to me a phony one. We promised the Europeans freedom. It would be worse than dishonorable not to see that they have it. This might mean war with the Russians, but what of it? They have no air force, and their gasoline and ammunition supplies are low. I've seen their miserable supply arrangements. I could break through their lines in 3 days." He wrote to military colleagues, "In my opinion, the American army as it now exists could beat the Russians with the greatest of ease, because while the Russians have good infantry, they are lacking in artillery, air, tanks, and in the knowledge of the use of combined arms. What is needed now is a leader who has the moral courage to do what is right for the United States and the backbone to tell the Russians where to get off. We should have done it 3 years ago." Old Blood and Guts wasn't just angry, he was heartbroken. George Smith Patton had spent his entire military career preparing for war, studying history, understanding strategy. He had led men through North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He had seen more combat, commanded more troops, and won more victories than almost any other United States general in history. And now, when his strategic vision was most needed, he was being dismissed as a warmonger and a has-been. The irony cut deep. During the war against Germany, Patton's aggressive instincts were celebrated. When he wanted to attack, to push forward, to take risks, he was called a genius. But now, when he wanted to confront the Soviet threat with the same aggressive spirit, he was called reckless and dangerous. George Smith Patton understood that he was being sidelined, not because he was wrong, but because he was right at the wrong time. December 9th, 1945. Old Blood and Guts was preparing to return to the United States for the holidays. He planned to resign from the army once back home and begin speaking publicly about the Soviet threat. Without the constraints of military discipline, he would be free to tell the American people everything he had witnessed. He was writing a book. He was planning speaking tours. George Smith Patton was going to force the nation to confront the reality of Stalin's ambitions, but he never got the chance. December 9th, 1945, near Mannheim, Germany. General George Smith Patton was riding in his staff car with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. They were on their way to a hunting trip, one of Patton's favorite activities during his time in Europe. The car was traveling on an icy road in overcast weather. At 11:50 in the morning, a United States Army truck made a sudden left turn directly into the path of Patton's vehicle. The staff car, traveling at moderate speed, couldn't avoid the collision. The vehicle struck. The impact wasn't severe. Gay and the driver were barely injured, but George Smith Patton, sitting in the back seat, was thrown forward. His head struck a metal partition or roof strut. The injury severed his spinal cord at the neck. Old Blood and Guts, the man who had survived 2 world wars, who had charged into machine gun fire, who had led tanks across minefields and faced artillery barrages and dodged bullets in a dozen battles, was paralyzed from the neck down by a minor traffic accident in occupied Germany. He was rushed to a United States Army hospital in Heidelberg. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize him. George Smith Patton remained conscious and mentally alert, but he couldn't move. The injury was catastrophic. His body, so strong and vital for 60 years, had betrayed him in an instant. For 12 days, George Smith Patton lay in that hospital bed, paralyzed and struggling. His wife Beatrice flew from the United States to be with him. His fellow generals visited, their faces grave. The man who had seemed indestructible was dying, and everyone knew it. He talked with Beatrice about his frustration, about everything he still wanted to do, about the warnings he still needed to deliver. "I'm going to die," he told her with characteristic bluntness. "Don't let them make a goddamn fool of me." December 21st, 1945. At 5:50 in the afternoon, General George Smith Patton died of a pulmonary embolism and congestive heart failure. Old Blood and Guts was gone. The most aggressive, controversial, brilliant, and prophetic general in United States military history was dead at 60 years old. The Army buried him in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg. Among the soldiers of the Third Army, he had led to victory. Thousands of troops attended the funeral. Generals wept openly. The man they called Old Blood and Guts was laid to rest in foreign soil, surrounded by the men who had died under his command. But the questions remained. The collision that paralyzed George Smith? Patton was never fully investigated. The truck driver who turned into Patton's path was never identified publicly. The circumstances were never explained satisfactorily. And in the decades since, historians and researchers have asked, was it really just an accident? Some pointed to the timing. George Smith Patton was about to return home and begin a public campaign against Soviet appeasement. He was preparing to write a book exposing Stalin's crimes. He was planning to testify before Congress. Old Blood and Guts was about to become the most prominent critic of United States foreign policy in the post-war world. And then, suddenly, he was silenced forever. Others noted the circumstances: a routine trip, an unexplained collision, injuries that wouldn't have killed most people but were fatal to someone Patton's age, a subsequent lack of investigation into what happened. It was almost too convenient. The United States government never suggested foul play. The official verdict was accidental death. But George Smith Patton's family and friends wondered. Soviet intelligence services had been operating in occupied Germany. The NKVD had assassinated enemies before. Stalin had every reason to want Old Blood and Guts silenced. Was the accident really an accident? Or was it the final act in a power struggle between two visions of the post-war world? We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is this: General George Smith Patton died before he could deliver his final warning to the American people. And the history that followed proved he had been right about everything. Within months of George Smith Patton's death, every prediction he had made began to come true. The Soviet Union refused to allow free elections in Poland. Communist governments were installed in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The Red Army occupied Eastern Germany and refused to leave. The Iron Curtain descended across Europe, exactly as Old Blood and Guts had warned. March 5, 1946. Less than 3 months after Patton's death, Winston Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. Standing beside President Truman, Churchill declared, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." He warned of Soviet expansion and called for Western unity against the communist threat. It was everything George Smith Patton had been saying since May of 1945. But when Patton said it, he was called a warmonger and removed from command. When Churchill said it, the world listened. Old Blood and Guts had been 9 months ahead of everyone else, and it had cost him everything. The generals who had dismissed Patton's warnings in that meeting at Reims began to change their tune. Eisenhower, who had silenced George Smith Patton and relieved him of command, wrote in his memoir years later, "George Patton was right about the Russians. I should have listened to him in 1945. We could have prevented much of what followed." Omar Bradley, who had clashed with Patton throughout the war, admitted, "George had an instinct about the Soviets that the rest of us lacked. He saw through Stalin when we were still trying to believe we could work with him." In retrospect, his analysis was absolutely correct. Even President Truman, who had never met Patton but had approved the policies of Soviet appeasement, later wrote, "If we had been more forceful with the Russians in 1945, if we had drawn clearer lines and backed them up with military strength, perhaps the Cold War could have been avoided, or at least fought on more favorable terms." But these admissions came too late. By the time Western leaders acknowledged that George Smith Patton had been right, Stalin controlled half of Europe. Millions of people were trapped behind the Iron Curtain. The Cold War was underway, and the United States would spend the next 45 years fighting the very threat that Old Blood and Guts had identified in the spring of 1945. The military officers who had dismissed Patton's warnings paid attention too late. In 1948, the Berlin blockade proved that Stalin had no interest in cooperation. The Soviets cut off all land access to West Berlin, trying to starve the city into submission. The United States was forced to conduct a massive airlift to keep Berlin alive. It was exactly the kind of confrontation George Smith Patton had predicted. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The nuclear monopoly that Old Blood and Guts had wanted to exploit in 1945 was gone. Now the United States faced a nuclear-armed adversary with control over half of Europe. Everything was harder. Everything was more dangerous. The window Patton had identified, when the United States held every advantage, had closed. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea with Soviet backing. The United States went to war in Asia to contain communist expansion. 36,000 United States soldiers died in that war. George Smith Patton had warned that failure to confront Stalin in Europe would lead to communist aggression elsewhere. He had been proven right again. Throughout the 1950s, Soviet tanks crushed uprisings in East Germany, Hungary, and Poland. Millions of Europeans who had been liberated from Nazi tyranny found themselves enslaved by communist tyranny. They begged for Western help that never came. The United States had the power to intervene in 1945, when Soviet forces were weak and exhausted. By the 1950s, intervention was impossible. Old Blood and Guts had seen this coming. He had begged his superiors to act. They had refused. In 1961, the Berlin Wall went up. The city that George Smith Patton's Third Army could have reached in days became the symbol of communist oppression. Families were divided. People were shot trying to escape to freedom. The wall stood for 28 years. It could have been prevented if the United States had followed Patton's advice in 1945. Military historians began to study George Smith Patton's warnings with new respect. War colleges taught courses on his analysis of the Soviet threat. Officers studied his intelligence reports from spring 1945 and marveled at his accuracy. Old Blood and Guts had understood Stalin's strategy before almost anyone else in the Western military establishment. What made Patton's analysis so prescient? Several factors. First, George Smith Patton studied history obsessively. He understood how empires behaved. He recognized that Stalin was building an empire, not liberating nations. Second, old blood and guts trusted his own eyes more than diplomatic platitudes. He saw what Soviet troops did in occupied territories. He talked to refugees and victims. He didn't rely on official Soviet statements. He relied on evidence. Third, George Smith Patton understood military power. He knew that wars are won by those willing to use force decisively when they have the advantage. The United States had overwhelming advantages in 1945. Battle-tested troops, superior equipment, air dominance, atomic weapons, and high morale. The Soviets were exhausted, under-equipped, and stretched thin. Patton recognized that this window wouldn't last. He wanted to exploit it before it closed. Fourth, old blood and guts wasn't constrained by political considerations. He didn't worry about what Congress would think or how the press would react. He focused solely on strategic reality. That made him dangerous to politicians, but it made his analysis brutally accurate. The United States press, which had celebrated Patton during the war and then condemned him in 1945, eventually came around. Journalists who had called him a warmonger in May of 1945 were praising his foresight by 1950. Time magazine, which had criticized his anti-Soviet comments, later wrote, "General Patton saw the Cold War coming before anyone else." His warnings, dismissed as paranoia in 1945, now read like prophecy. The men of the Third Army never forgot their commander. Veterans organizations kept George Smith Patton's memory alive. They told stories of his leadership, his courage, his aggressive spirit, and they repeated his warnings about the Soviet Union. Old blood and guts had been right. His soldiers knew it, and they made sure the next generation knew it too. By the 1980s, when President Ronald Reagan began confronting the Soviet Union more aggressively, military and political leaders explicitly invoked George Smith Patton's name. Reagan himself said, "General Patton understood that weakness invites aggression. He wanted to confront the Soviets when we had the advantage. We didn't listen. It took us 40 years to finish the job he identified in 1945. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, when communist governments collapsed across Eastern Europe, when the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, historians returned to George Smith Patton's predictions. Everything he had warned about in the spring of 1945 had come to pass. The Cold War had lasted exactly as long as he feared. The human cost had been exactly as high as he predicted, and the final victory could have come decades earlier if the United States had acted when old blood and guts urged action. Today, historians recognize General George Smith Patton as one of the most prophetic military figures of the 20th century. His warnings about the Soviet Union in 1945 stand as a masterclass in strategic analysis. While politicians celebrated victory, while generals planned parades, old blood and guts was looking ahead, seeing threats, and demanding action. The United States military still studies what has become known as Patton's warning. At the Army War College at West Point, at command and staff colleges around the nation, officers analyze George Smith Patton's 1945 intelligence reports and strategic recommendations. They study not just his tactical brilliance in combat, but his strategic vision in recognizing long-term threats. The lessons are clear. First, strategic vision requires looking beyond immediate victories to future challenges. George Smith Patton won the battles in front of him while simultaneously analyzing what would come next. Second, speaking truth to power is dangerous but necessary. Old blood and guts paid a price for his honesty, but history proved he was right. Third, windows of opportunity close quickly. The strategic advantages the United States held in 1945 disappeared within years. Patton understood that timing matters in grand strategy as much as in tactical combat. Some historians argue that even if the United States had followed Patton's advice, war with the Soviet Union might not have been necessary. Simply maintaining military strength in Europe, drawing clear lines, and demonstrating willingness to use force might have deterred Stalin. George Smith Patton wasn't necessarily advocating for immediate attack. He was advocating for strength and resolve. The United States chose weakness and appeasement instead, and paid for it with 45 years of Cold War. Others argue that war with the Soviet Union in 1945 would have been catastrophic regardless of United States advantages. The American public was exhausted. The troops wanted to come home. Starting another major war might have been politically impossible. Perhaps Patton was right about the threat, but wrong about the solution. But everyone agrees on this. General George Smith Patton identified the defining challenge of the post-war era before anyone else. While others celebrated, he warned. While others assumed good faith from Stalin, he recognized tyranny. While others planned for peace, he prepared for the next war. Old blood and guts saw the future with clarity that his contemporaries lacked. The mystery of his death remains. Was the December 9th, 1945, accident really an accident? Or was George Smith Patton assassinated before he could return to the United States and launch his public campaign against Soviet appeasement? We'll never know for certain. The evidence is circumstantial. The investigation was minimal. The truth died with old blood and guts on that December afternoon in a United States Army hospital in Heidelberg. What we do know is that the world lost one of its most brilliant military minds at the moment when his vision was most needed. George Smith Patton might have changed the course of history. His voice, his leadership, his willingness to confront hard truths might have given political leaders the courage to act differently in those critical months after Germany's surrender. Instead, he was silenced, sidelined, and ultimately died before he could make his case to the American people. The legend of old blood and guts lives on precisely because he was willing to say what others wouldn't, to see what others couldn't, and to demand action when others sought rest. General George Smith Patton embodied aggressive, forward-thinking leadership. He never accepted conventional wisdom. He never let politics constrain his strategic thinking. He never stopped fighting, even when the war was officially over. His warnings about the Soviet Union stand as his final great contribution to United States national security. George Smith Patton gave his country one last gift: the truth about the threat we faced. That we chose to ignore his warning doesn't diminish its value. History proved old blood and guts right about everything. Today, when military leaders study grand strategy, when they analyze how to identify emerging threats, when they discuss the courage required to challenge political orthodoxy, they return to General George Smith Patton. His example teaches that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on the battlefield, but in the planning rooms, the political debates, and the struggle to make leaders see reality clearly. This is why they called him old blood and guts, not just because he led from the front in combat, not just because he demanded aggressive action and bold tactics, but because he had the guts to speak truth regardless of the cost. George Smith Patton sacrificed his command, his reputation, and perhaps ultimately his life to warn his nation about the Soviet threat. He was a warrior to the very end, not fighting Germans with tanks, but fighting ignorance with truth. The greatest tragedy of the 20th century might be this: we had a military genius who saw the Cold War coming and told us exactly how to prevent it or win it quickly. We had General George Smith Patton, battle-tested and proven right again and again, standing before us with maps and evidence and passion, begging us to act, and we sent him away. We silenced old blood and guts when we needed him most. If this story of George Smith Patton's final warning moved you, if you're shocked that history proved him right, if you understand now why they called him old blood and guts, then subscribe to this channel. We're bringing you more untold stories of General George Smith Patton, the greatest combat commander in United States history, the man who saw the future, the warrior who never stopped fighting for his country, even when his country stopped listening. His prophecies shaped the world we live in today. His courage should inspire us still. His warnings echo through history. Strength deters aggression. Weakness invites it, and sometimes the most important battles are the ones we choose not to fight. General George Smith Patton, old blood and guts, American legend, prophet of the Cold War, the warning Eisenhower refused to hear,